Hello, everyone. Larry Bailey here, Mortgage Workflow Partners. Today is Tuesday. It's 4 o'clock, and that means that we are going to be having another community call. Today, I'm nervous. We're using Microsoft Teams as a platform, and I know that we are going to have lots of interesting experiences, one of which is going to be this beep, 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 which I know I've already allowed to let everybody through. So we're going to go ahead and figure that out. We've also got some Q&A loaded on here. And so that's going to be interesting to go ahead and leverage out. Hopefully we've got the ability to leverage out some functionality. Most importantly, I want to make sure that we've got call-in numbers. I want to make sure that we've got the ability to have better recording and better takeaway notes for the replay, because there are a ton of people that watch this replay. And if you're watching it, thank you very much. And we'll figure out some of this stuff as we go. Today's topic is all about leveraging automation and leveraging it between both your desktop as well as your web settings. For those that are just joining, thank you very much. Hopefully there wasn't too much trouble coming on in terms of accessing it. I've gone ahead and moved to Teams for this presentation. I've also automatically disabled your microphone and your camera, so you don't have to worry about that. That's still the case. And what I really want to know is if you've got an ability to have a question, go ahead and launch it either in Q&A. If you want to actually ask it on audio or video, go ahead and make sure that you are either raising your hand, so that should be there for you for that. And we'll go ahead and get into this. So these events are really hosted for communities. Luba asks right away, does anyone know if it's possible to lock loans through Blend, through OB? Candace says, no, it's not. So hopefully that makes sense, Luba. And Luba's crying, and I'm sorry to hear that. So that stinks. When we get into working through automation, right, and the what we've been working with desktop all these years, really gets a little bit confusing when I found, at least with the folks I'm working with. It gets a little bit confusing when you try to work into web settings and knowing where to turn with workflow rules versus desktop rules. I do want to give this one call out. I've heard this happen, I've heard this mentioned a couple of times with mostly with some third-party vendors. And that has to do with ASO bots, so automated service orders bots, ASO. And I wanted to just make sure that everybody on this call watching replay understands it's in ICE's game plan to deprecate ASO. So I think we've talked about this a little bit earlier. If you've got ASO in your settings, so in other words, if we go over into your, we'll go ahead and get this down here and launch this over here. So if we go over into admin and we come over into automation rules, so we come over services management. Also, let me know if you guys are seeing the screen okay. Just give me a hands up, thumbs up, whatever. Hopefully you guys are seeing it okay. But when we come over into automation rules, you have an option when creating these automation rules in here. Right now, you've got ASO bot, and that is going away. So what's expected to happen here is if you've got any ASO rules set up, those will not be deprecated in the next release coming out in December. But if you do have the ASO rules still running with 25.1, the guidance we've been giving and sharing is that ICE will be deprecating and those rules will disappear. They'll just vaporize. So go through your rules, check to make sure you don't have any ASO bot rules. If you do, get them converted to Workflow Engine, please. With 24.3, you're no longer going to be able to click add and then choose the kind. That won't be there. And then actually it looks like it might have even been updated. So make sure you go ahead and review that setting, making sure you've addressed all of your ASOs to get them into Workflow Engine. All right, so I want to get that off the top. Now, when it comes to automation, October is like the month of automation. I want to go through a bunch of different series each week talking about different kinds of automation. And I thought the very first topic I'd share with you today was really understanding the distinction of when to use certain kinds of rules, concepts. I'd love to hear feedback on the Q&A or the chat here with regards to how you feel about this. But the first one I wanted to really talk about was kind of a combination rule set, and it's leveraging milestone completion and field data entry business rules. Part of the challenge with field data entry business rules, if you haven't had the experience yet, is you get this moment where if you're doing like an e-disclosure order button business rule, which you can only do through FDE, right? And so what ends up happening is the user doesn't quite understand what's missing from the FDE. So they kind of go around in a circle sometimes trying to figure things out. And just as, let me know if anybody else has done this, but you can leverage milestone completion business rules in conjunction with the fields that you're requiring for the FDE rule for the e-disclosure button, so that if they run into a problem where the e-disclosure button isn't enabled, and this happened literally yesterday for me on a project, leveraging milestone completion in conjunction with that lets the user visualize whatever fields are required. Now, the fields, if you think about it, like in this is my environment, right? So in my particular milestone, in my particular workflow, I might have a milestone here that isn't for disclosures, but by the time the loan is sent to processing, all of the fields that were needed for disclosures are already met. And I leverage those fields in conjunction with the FDE rule for the e-disclosure button, so that if anyone is stuck, I simply tell them, go to the processing milestone worksheet and look for those missing fields that can be completed on the milestone worksheet. This has worked really well, and I'm going to talk more about this in greater detail next week with automating initial disclosures. So if you're around for next week and you're interested in automating your initial disclosures natively, this is one of the methodologies that I deployed to help users understand what was missing in addition to another input form that I created. So has anyone ever done this before, where you've cascaded or combined, maybe not cascade is the right word, but you combined FDE rules and milestone completion rules to not only give the visualization, but also on the outcome that you're looking for? So food for thought. If you've never done it, and again, if you've ever had a situation where somebody doesn't quite know what's missing for an FDE rule, give it a shot. Give it an idea. Think about your workflow for where they could go. So Candace says here they don't really like to use the required fields in FDE. I don't really get it, but it's a thing. My first project here was to convert existing FDE rules, fleshing out the message to let people know what's missing. And what Candace just said in chat is exactly what I'm talking about. So nobody likes trying to click getting an error message, trying to click getting an error message. And so there's been some really clever people that have tried to create visual UIs to give them an idea of what's missing. So Sean, what we're talking about is when you're dealing with an FDE rule, field data entry rule, specific to e-disclosures is what I'm talking about right now. Giving them a place to go visualize what's missing from that. I mirror the FDE rule with a milestone completion so they can see that advanced list of missing fields. So Luba says we have created an input form to visualize, but it's not ideal. And again, when you create an input form, one of the things that you're going to limit yourself is Encompass Web. So that's why I'm thinking of this. And so it looks like what Candace just dropped in a bunch of cool little code in there. Looks like a message box. You're doing some looks like there's some code in there that's presenting a message, right, Candace? So that's when somebody's missing something, looks like you're doing some stuff that's missing. So definitely interesting. I'd love for you to come next week and see what we're doing with regards to automating initial disclosures, because naturally to get to initial disclosures, you've got to be able to click the e-disclosure button. but knowing what's missing out of your entire file, which includes for fees, services, fields, all this stuff is relative. And so I'll explain more next week. It's a teaser for you. The next one is field triggers versus DDMs. So again, natively, I'm sure everybody on here has written at least one field trigger rule, probably at least one DDM rule. And so what I like to really just go into detail here is making sure that you understand when to use a field trigger, when to use a DDM for desktop automation. This is also important for web-based stuff. And so when you're thinking about, does this data need to be that value always based upon a condition? That's DDM, hands down. And so when you think about, does it also need to be a field trigger, or should it be a DDM and always be running and not be a field trigger? That's the part where you've got to understand your workflow. And so when I go through this conversation, I recently met with somebody and they've got like 100 active DDM field rules. Now they've got their conditioning built out fairly well, but it's probably can use a little bit of tweaking. But the idea is they're concerned about when they compare their dev system, which has a large series of active DDMs versus their prod that has a lot of active versus their dev that doesn't. They can see a performance hit, and so the question is, how impactful are DDMs to field triggers? What I would encourage you to understand is that write the conditional statements within your DDMs so that they are only running appropriately. And this includes your start rules as well as your stop rules. So if you're thinking about this and you're wondering how to make sure that the data is what it needs to be, especially as we get, I want you to remember that we're getting more and more involved with external parties inserting data into your file, that you need to make sure that if it affects the file in a specific way, like let's say title integrations bring in certain information, appraisal integrations, flood, taxes, verifications. These are all systems that are going to be feeding into your loan file that are not going to trigger native field triggers. What are you going to do about it? And so that's why I wanted to really bring up the field trigger versus DDM, because it's not so clear anymore as far as what you should be using always. And again, if anybody has any questions, use the chat. There's a Q&A spot within Teams. Feel free to light it up. We'll get to them. The next one is really focusing in on persona access to fields versus persona access to loans. I've talked about this a lot, and unfortunately, there's still a ton of confusion around this particular topic, mostly because of multiple persona syndrome. So earlier today in the admin class, this came up. We were talking about this, and apparently there might be a document floating out there from ICE or maybe somebody else where it talks about if you've got a user with multiple personas, which persona, singular, is a persona access to fields or a persona access to loans business rule going to latch onto? And the reality is it's uncertain. It's in some cases unpredictable. So when you go through, we want to make sure that as best as you can, round your users down to one persona and make sure, if that's not possible, make sure that you go through and check your rules so that you don't have a persona conflict. I've seen this happen a lot when it comes to business rules and automation. Automation's failing to happen, or automation restrictions failing to happen because of this multiple persona problem. So if you're really confused about the way a user account is behaving because they've got multiple personas, what I've seen be a possible work through is making sure that the user account has the most prominent persona that you want to be affected as their oldest persona assigned. So in English, if you've got multiple personas, what I typically do is I disassociate those personas from the user account. I add in a testing persona, so the table's blank. I then add in the most prominent persona to that user account, save the user. So that persona gets assigned to that user account in the persona table for that user. I'll then add other personas as it goes. This is not meant to be an end-all be-all answer. The entire platform is still subject to interpretation as far as which persona gets tagged in that business rule. I'm just letting you know that when you're working through these persona-based rules, if you've got multiple personas tied to a particular user account, be very careful. Even if you have a test account that has all the same personas, the only way you're legitimately going to know if what you're building is working properly is to sign in as that user. That's the reality. And so, so Jim's like, that persona limitation is wonky as heck. Yeah, it's troublesome, Jim, right? And so it's hard because everybody wants to go ahead and just keep giving people all the job functions that they need. But the reality is you don't want to do that. And I know it's easy, right? And I know it's tempting, and I know, like, why can't you? Not to say you can't. You're going to have the ability to limit their interaction with the loan file. It's going to become that much more complicated. All right, let's get into some crossover stuff. And so, as you are getting, hopefully, more used to working with web and workflow rules, things like that, reset. Hopefully, you've been digging into workflow rules as I've been talking about them and sharing ideas and sharing concepts. And so the reality is, like, when do you focus in on a workflow rule versus a DDM versus a field trigger? And the idea of this is making sure you understand, not only when you look at a workflow rule, understanding what triggers a workflow rule, because you've got standard objects that you're used to working with, as well as reliable virtual objects, as well as brand new objects you've never worked with. Things like services being fulfilled as a triggering event, or a file being attached, or a condition being added. These are all, or even a document being added to the loan file. These are all new concepts, or even a role being assigned. These are all new concepts that maybe you were doing something tricky with third-party tech to look for the virtual update to use as a reliable field trigger. So where I'm headed with this is, if you did do that, if you did use third-party or are using third-party tech to grab a virtual field, to convert it to a custom field, to use a field trigger, I want you to really come out, document what those things are, and start building those into workflow rules for a bunch of reasons. Number one, whatever you're using today for what I just said is probably SDK based. So we know that's going away. Number one. Number two, you don't need to use third-party tech if your triggering events are here. Just use this. And so one of the things that I would encourage you to do as far as an easier project is to make sure that you look in your field triggers that are being used to fire emails that are not grabbing attachments. Because yes, if you've got a workflow where your triggering event in desktop is grabbing an attachment and sending that out, I'm not saying that you can reproduce that here, but what I am saying is that you can reproduce everything else, and you should start asking yourself, why are you emailing attachments? Now, you could say, well, that's because it's going to a third party with the approval letter, or it's going to a borrower with the goodbye letter or the adverse letter. Those are good use cases. And so the point is, that's not every use case. There's a ton of field triggers right now in your environment with emails going to internal or external roles in the file to notify them of things. Start using this. I've said this before. One of the bigger things that you want to think about is getting your IT teams involved, where you can tell them there's a way to unwind the SMTP account. They're going to love you for this. It's a big problem. And if you don't know if it's a big problem, you'll find out if you bring it up. And so what I would encourage you to do is look at your opportunities within your field triggers, firing emails, notifications. Look at moving to workflow rules. DDM, I mentioned earlier, you can't run a workflow rule based upon a non-trigger. So in other words, if you have a field being a certain value, that's a triggering event. So field value modified. And if the field value being modified is a standard customer virtual field, you can address that here. So if your third-party integration is now updating a field through field mapping or dropping a file into a document, you can use those events to cause other results. One of the things that I'm still not settled in on is the triggering event of service order fulfilled. I don't personally feel comfortable with that. I'm sharing this with you just as personal insight, not anything else. I don't like building things on services being fulfilled because I don't really know what that means to every service. What I do know is fields values being modified, whether they're standard, custom, or virtual fields. That I can touch and feel. And so that's important to understand. Again, when do I use DDM versus when can I use workflow? And the last one is field triggers. Now, field trigger, one of the things that you have to remember here is the result is I can only update a custom field. It's kind of a drag if you were trying to use workflow rules to update standard fields. So I can't do that, right? If I've got a standard field that I need updated based upon some other conditional action, I'm going to be stuck with field triggers right now in desktop. But it's important to understand those distinctions so that you can plan accordingly. Candace asks, I've been on chat, I've been wondering that recently myself. Notifications are easy. One of the recent tasks to convert our auto assign tool into workflow, of course, it works best at lone create. It's trickier with field changes since there's a delay until the user. Yeah, so when you go through and you're really focusing on the triggering event, Candace, keep me on track here, but where the loan is created, we've never been able to do anything like that. And so you can use this triggering event for predictable results in a way that I think you're talking about. We use role assigned. Okay, another great one where if a role is assigned and you pick the role, and then Candace, I don't know if you're doing this or not, but remember, when you do this, you can pick a specific user as well. And so this is helpful to really focus in on. Sean asks, are all workflow rules running only after a user exits the file? All workflow rules are running based upon the triggering event, Sean. So whether that triggering event is, I don't know, you don't have to be logged into desktop. You don't have to be logged into the file. Workflow engine is running workflow rules always. So is that what you're asking? Or are you asking the things that the workflow engine can do only happening? So services right now can only be run after the file is available. So Sean, is that what you're asking? Let me know if I'm on track. I don't know. But yeah, workflow rules are always running. Services. So if your result is to order a service, right? Order a service. So the sequencing here, if you haven't done this yet, it's a little bit, it's important to understand the sequence for this. When you go into services management, if you configure an automation rule, flood is the one we've talked about a lot here, right? So when you configure your flood, this is what it will look like. This is not done. This is just setting up the ability to automatically order the service. It's like a two-step. First thing you're going to do is configure the automation rule here so that within this service, within right here, I'm just using CoreLogic as an example, this service will order under this user account with this condition. That's the execution of the service order. But to actually engage a service order, you're going to use a workflow rule to actually automate that order. So in other words, if your triggering event is, ITB is updated, the result of that is going to be ordering the service, and then your service is going to be the flood automation. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Really important to make sure automating requires the service to be automated, and then it requires the workflow rules to start the automation. All right, so Candace says I should back up. All right, so Candace outlines in chat exactly what she's doing. Thank you, Candace, for that update. Before we run out of time here, because I've got about 5 minutes left, I want to talk about the ideas of, again, going back to field triggers for emails versus workflow rules for notification templates. This is really important to understand because notification templates, again, cannot contain attachments. They're not meant to. I don't know if they ever will, quite honestly. It's a security thing about grabbing something and sending it through email. Like that's not something you typically do. You typically direct somebody to go pick it up from a download. And I know it's inconvenient, and I know different companies have different policies, which is why, there might be something beyond native functionality that you have to use. Scheduler templates are really important to make sure that you're understanding when those notifications go out. So again, using some simple functionality within web in leveraging this automation, if you are having people in your workflow send emails based upon something that's happening, this is a moment to actually free them from that process, where you can create either an automatic workflow event to end up having a notification sent out, or you can have an event create a scheduler to start running. And that start running can be X number of days after an event or X number of days before an event. And when you go and you build these schedulers, by the way, it doesn't have to be, any particular number, and it doesn't have to be any particular time zone. It also doesn't have to be any particular calendar. Lots of options in here to conform to whatever your workflow is. And the whole point of me bringing this up is looking at your workflow, looking at the technology that you're currently using, getting ready for better automation solutions is important to understand what's available. And so part of what was interesting to me looking at the combination and the crossover between desktop and web settings was the concept of having something happening in desktop based upon a workflow rule that's tied to a custom field. So I'll give you a good what if scenario that I come across sometimes. And the idea is there's a custom field that I need to have updated. I'm going to use a workflow rule that could end up being the result of a scheduler being finished. So here's a good example. Maybe you use pipeline views or dashboards, maybe reports too, but pipeline views or dashboards, and you're using a custom field calc that is based upon the today value minus something else, right? And which doesn't work because Encompass doesn't know what today is. So how do you deal with it? And there's been a lot of effort put on this. Some people develop third-party tech or homegrown tech to literally go through their entire pipeline overnight to tell the file what today is, so these custom field calcs can work. So instead of doing that, what I would encourage you to think about doing is leveraging workflow rules to start a scheduler where the result of that updates a custom field inside the loan file. Brian's like, that's the way I did it, meaning I built a piece of software to open and close the file. Believe me, you're not the only one, Brian. There's many, many companies that have deployed that technology because they relied upon how many days until this other thing happened based upon what today is. Naturally, you can do some other potential custom field calcs to do date diffs to figure these things out. But again, the idea is I want you to really start looking at conceptually what you can do with your workflow rules in connection with your desktop business rules that we've all been used to in concepts that you might not have thought about. That's what today was all about. So I hope that I've been kind of poking at the idea corner of your brain. I hope that leveraging this concept of leveraging multiple kinds of rules together gives you an idea of the things that I talk about, like when I'm doing workflow reviews or I'm doing ideas. Candace had never considered using a schedule to update a custom field. I hadn't either until I started thinking about Workflow Engine knows what today is. It always does. And so I can create a scheduler. Normally, like what came out of the box was, 5 days before closing, send an email. Well, that's counterproductive to what I've been saying, like let's get rid of email. So instead of sending an email, why don't we just update a custom field that pops up onto somebody's dashboard or alerts or pipeline view and do it that way. Can you schedule emails with reports? Tell me more, Sean. I'm not sure. Emails with reports. Can we schedule emails? Whatever's coming out in your report is a calculation based upon something that you can build into the scheduler that you can, at the end of that scheduler, fire an email, like a daily Encompass report. Oh, can you automatically email a report? That's what you're asking. No, and nor should you need to. The reason why you're emailing a report is because people don't have a reliable, easy way to get to their pipeline view. That's the reason why you're emailing it. I've had these conversations in workflow reviews day in, day out. The reason why people want these reports emailed is because going into Encompass, running a report, looking at data is not something they want to spend time to do because it's a pain in the ass to get into Encompass. That's the reality with desktop, with your environment. Managers don't log into Encompass, all this other stuff. So which Candace, I say build them a dashboard that goes on to what they're looking at. Give them Encompass on the web on their phone with a pipeline view that gives them the data they're looking for. They don't need to log into Encompass. They can just click a link and log in with, especially if you've got SSO enabled, they can just click a link and go in and look at their pipeline view. These are all concepts that are going to change the way your business runs. And I hope that I'm sharing some good ideas for you. I wonder if dashboards will make it to the web. I obviously don't have any insight on that personally, but there's no reason why not. I think we're going to see a lot more come to the web in the coming years as soon as we get some basic functionality for the entire workflow built into Encompass Web. So that's all I got for today, gang. You guys have a good rest of your day, great rest of your week. Thanks for coming. Hopefully this platform gives us a little bit more insight. When I post the replay, hopefully Copilot gives me the results I'm looking for. I'll post it on the community. You guys have a great rest of your day. Enjoy. Be well. See you now.